Mike Bush is an internationally recognized author and speaker on natural beekeeping. He's the author of The Practical Beekeeper, which has been published in 5 languages and is one of the authoritative sources on sustainable beekeeping without chemical treatments. His website, bushfarms.com, is an invaluable source of information on natural, chemical-free beekeeping and just plain beekeeping. If it's in his book, it's typically on his website. There's lots of awesome information you could search there, as well as purchasing his books on Amazon and other venues. There's also some additional options, I believe, listed on his website. The topics are based on the questions that come up on beekeeping forums over and over. The wisdom of his methods is evidenced by the fact that he successfully keeps bees through the harsh winters of Nebraska, which I probably would wager are a little tougher than ours. Not sure if we'd want to get into a fight about that one, though. Michael, are you there? Make sure you got Mike.
There we go.
Hi, Michael.
Howdy.
Thanks for joining us. Glad to have you here today.
Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay. It wasn't letting me unmute, so okay. So can I share my screen?
Yep, you should have screen sharing capabilities.
There we go. How's that?
Looks good. Everything's working.
So shall we jump right into this?
Yep, let's go.
Okay. So I'm going to talk about common issues here. It's basically a whole bunch of topics, all of which you could probably spend more time on, but I'm just kind of hit the highlights of them. Before I get too far, all presentations are on my website. So if you go too fast and you wanted to write something down and you missed it, and go back and look at it again, as long as you've got some kind of a viewer for PowerPoint, that's there. But if you just go to bushfarms.com and go to bees and look down the left hand side till you get to presentations, you'll get there. As he already said, I have some books for sale, but pretty much everything in my books are on my website. There might be a little bit in the most recent ones that aren't. The queen rearing one, that detail's not all on there, and the beekeeping naturally, a simple recipe, might have a little bit of stuff in there that's not exactly on my website, but pretty much the information's probably there. There's ebooks available on my website as well. If you want to buy my book, you can go to Barnes & Noble or any online bookseller. But if you want to buy the ebooks, you'll have to buy it from me because, frankly, Amazon wants 40% of what it sells for if I sell an ebook on Amazon, and of actual physical book, they only want 20%. So I don't understand the difference, but apparently they think ebooks are more valuable. So also I'd like to mention I have a bee camp coming up. The details are on my website if you want to go look at it, but basically I call it my Tom Sawyer bee camp. I want you to come to my house, do all my work for me, and pay me for the privilege. But seriously, we'll probably learn a lot. And if you can't afford to come, if you can't afford to pay, you can come a week early if you got more time than money and help me fix up things around my house and my farm here. And you can earn a week of camp. Also, I have an apprenticeship. I have several coming right now, but I probably could use one or maybe two more, but probably one more. Anyway, basically, I want you to come at the beginning of the season and stay to the end of the bee season. And I'll teach you everything I can teach you in that amount of time, whatever you're willing to listen to. And we'll raise a lot of queens and inspect lots of hives and find thousands of queens in the process. So let's talk about issues. This is a general way to look at issues. I think the first thing you need to realize when you're freaking out about your bees is that probably doing nothing is better than doing something and you don't know for sure if it's going to help. I think one of the philosophical changes you need to make is you need to realize that whatever the bees are doing right now, it's probably the right thing from their point of view. It may not be the right thing from your point of view, but it's probably the right thing from their point of view. If they're trying to swarm, it's the right thing from their point of view because the conditions are correct for that to happen. So you need to think in terms of the bees probably know what they're doing. Now, I'd make two exceptions to just waiting until you think it through. And that would be if they're being robbed, you need to stop the robbing as quickly as possible. And if they're swarming and they're hanging on a tree, you probably want to catch them pretty quickly because in 2 hours, they're likely to leave. They probably won't leave sooner than that, but I have seen them just barely land and take off. So those two things you probably don't want to put off, but otherwise, almost everything else, I would put it off and I would talk to your friends, your beekeeping mentors, whatever, and see what they say before you jump in and start doing things that then you realize were a bad idea. This quote from Richard Taylor, I like. Richard Taylor is amazingly good with words. Of course, he was a philosopher and a beekeeper, and that probably shows in the way he writes. But I like this one. Matters are seldom made worse by doing nothing and are often made much worse by inept intervention. So this is one of the situations people often find themselves in. You look in the hive, you can't find any brood and you can't find any eggs. Now, as Natalie mentioned in the last one, a lot of times all you really need to know may just be that there's brood and eggs, and then you know you got a queen, and then you're done with your inspection because that was your goal, was to make sure they were queen right. You probably ought to always go at beekeeping from the point of view before you ever open a hive up. You have a goal in mind. What am I trying to find out? What do I want to know? And usually this is the thing you want to know is are they queen right? And do they have enough food? And everything else is kind of esoteric, but sometimes you need to go and find much more information. But let's say you open it up and there's no queen, there's no brood and there's no eggs. And you didn't see the queen. Well, in this case, they're saying, I guess I said, even though there is a queen. So there's no brood and there's no eggs, but there is a queen. So the question is, why are they broodless? Now, I'm in Nebraska and you guys are mostly in Michigan, I think. Probably people from other places. In Nebraska in October, it's real likely there's no brood because it's winter. You know, winter's coming and they're preparing for it by shutting down brood rearing. Also, they may have stopped rearing brood because there's a dearth. Now, I gotta watch this carefully in Nebraska because if I don't get that last batch of young bees going into winter, they won't make it to spring because we've got 6 months quite often of winter and those bees need to make it 6 months. And field bees from the summer are not going to make it 6 months. I need that last batch of fat bees, winter bees that are physiologically different because they are fat. They have more fat bodies. I need those bees going into winter. So that's another thing to consider is, did I get that last batch of young bees or was there a dearth and that's why they've shut down and they're not rearing brood? So what I want to do is figure out, why are they broodless? The other thing is sometimes even in the summer, if I have a dearth, they may shut down brood rearing, especially if you're raising bees that are more frugal, either because they're stock that was feral that you've been raising now because you captured them, or stock that is just frugal by their nature, such as Carniolans, Caucasians, Russians. All of them tend to be more frugal, and they'll shut down brood rearing in the middle of summer sometimes because there's just not enough pollen coming in, and they decide they don't need more mouths to feed. So the other reason you may see a queen in here and she's not laying is that they've raised a queen and she's just not laying yet. And meanwhile, all the brood has emerged and she's just getting mated right now and then is going to start laying. So you need to consider that. I guess my point is don't jump to the conclusion that there's something wrong with this queen because there's no brood. But you might want to keep notes and pay attention and come back. If she's just not laying yet, odds are she'll be laying in about a week, possibly 2, but more than likely in a week she should be laying from when she emerged. So you might want to come back in a week, check it out, see what's happening. So anyway, the idea is you got to figure out why they're broodless and then respond accordingly. Now, if 2 weeks later they're still broodless, there's still a queen in there, I might start getting worried that maybe this queen just isn't going to lay at all. If a queen never mates, she doesn't lay. And sometimes you'll see a queen with a damaged wing and she just never flies out to mate and she just never lays. I know people will tell you they'll turn into drone layers, but they actually don't. They just don't lay. The drone layers are the ones that mated late. If it takes them like 3 weeks to get mated, then they turn into a drone layer. But if they never lay it, if they never mate at all, they just never lay. So the other thing is if you can't find the queen, and you don't find any brood, a typical conclusion people jump to is that they're queenless. And the fact is you might be queenless. The problem is you also, actually the odds are more in favor that they're not queenless because usually they manage to raise a queen. It's more likely that they've raised a queen and she's just not laying yet. And you'll buy a queen, you put a queen in and they kill her because they have a queen. They don't want your queen. And you do that. I've seen people do that like 2 or 3 times. And on the 3rd queen, they bought a queen, put her in, they killed her. They ordered another queen, they put her in, killed her. They ordered another queen, and then they're introducing that queen, and they get in there and they see eggs, and then they realize, oh, well, I do have a queen. So the better solution, in my opinion, is to give them a frame of brood. Even better if you have some hive that's trying to swarm and has already made some queen cells, give them a queen cell. Or if you're a queen breeder and you're raising queens, give them a queen cell. That'll give them a little more of a head start. But one of the reasons I like to do that is I want local stock. I don't want to buy a queen from someplace other than where I live and introduce her, because what I really want is local stock. Local stock has made more of a difference in my wintering here than anything else I've done. I need bees that are hardy enough to survive Nebraska winters and not bees that are only hardy enough to survive in California. So a frame of eggs and brood, if I give them that, they can raise a queen, and you'll have a queen maybe sooner than you think. I guess it depends on what you think, but some people are convinced that they're going to start from an egg, so therefore it's going to be 16 days before they have a virgin queen. But that's not true. They're going to start with a larva that's the right age, which is already 4 days old. Unless, of course, like I said, if you already had a queen cell because some other hive was trying to swarm, now you got one that's going to probably emerge in the next 4 days or so on average. And they may have a queen a lot sooner, but I think it's more important that I get a local queen than it is that I get a queen sooner. Of course, the other problem is I think people overestimate how much sooner you'll have one if you buy one. Because if you buy a queen, first of all, you got to find one, then you got to order it. And then by the time it gets here, that's probably 4 days since you realized you were queenless. And now you introduce her in a cage. So it's 4 more days before they release her. And I've had queens that I've purchased that took 2 weeks before they started to lay after they emerged after they got them out of the cage. So that could be 3 to 4 weeks. And in 4 weeks, they'll probably raise one and have her laying anyway. and I got some local stock. Now, that was a worst case scenario for the purchasing one, and a normal scenario for they're going to raise their own, but still, I don't think there's as much difference as you might think. Um, and back to the frame of eggs and brood, it's a solution for lots of things, and we'll get into more of it later. But actually, anytime your hive's just not quite right, sometimes even though they have a queen, things just aren't taking off. Sometimes a frame of brood will really stimulate them to get going again, especially if you take a frame of brood covered in bees, make sure the queen's not on it, and give it to the weaker hive. Sometimes they just take right off. And there could be a whole lot of factors that cause that. One of them could be actually the microbes that are in the healthy hive and are not in the hive that's struggling, because they may get that. Plus, I think the pheromones from the brood stimulates them. Open brood stimulates them in a lot of ways. It keeps them from developing laying workers. It motivates them to go get pollen. In a lot of ways it motivates them. So let's say you open up your hive and you have lots of drone brood. I hear this all the time because people will email me. They're all freaked out because there's all these drones in their hive, and there's lots of drones and lots of drone brood. Well, if you've got 100% drone brood, then you've got a drone laying queen, or you've got laying workers. So that's a problem. But it's normal to have 20% drone comb. If you got 20% drone comb and 80% worker brood, 20% drone brood and 80% worker brood, that's just normal. And if you got 20% drones in the spring during swarm season, that's normal. That means 1 in 5 of your bees is a drone. But that doesn't last long. That's just that peak when they're thinking about swarming in the spring, and then it drops off in the summer. You know, it'll be more like 1 in 20 or 40 in the summer, depending on the race of bees and depending on the supply of resources. Because the more resources there are, the more that likely they're going to spend some of it on drones. But you should never be seeing more than 20% drones, and you should never be seeing more than about 20% drone comb. Maybe 25, but probably not over 25. 20 is pretty typical. So if you see more than 20%, then you probably have a laying queen or laying workers. So let's talk about both of those. Why does I'm on a different page on one of mine than the other one? I don't know. A late mated queen, as I said before, will turn into a drone layer. If she doesn't get mated within 3 weeks of when she emerged, she'll almost always turn into a drone layer. The other cause of drone layers, this had been my speculation for a long time, and I finally found some research to back it up that Tarpey did, and that was that if a queen gets chilled in the winter, sometimes that turns her into a drone layer. Now, I came up with that theory because it seemed like often that's when I would see drone layers, is first thing in the spring. I would have a hive that was doing fine last year, and now it's got a drone laying queen. And I think it's because the cluster got so small they couldn't keep warm on one of those 20 below nights, and the queen got chilled and it kills the sperm. And Tarpey actually did some research and proved that that is the case. That if the sperm gets chilled, it can kill the sperm, and then you get a drone laying queen. So it usually, I suppose there's 3 possible causes. Usually a drone laying queen is either because she got mated late or she got chilled. But the third reason is she just ran out of sperm. And that would usually be a really old queen, like 3 years or so old. Sometimes she'll just run out of sperm, and then she'll start laying. It'll look like she's laying really spotty. What she's actually doing is probably laying fairly consistently, but they aren't getting fertilized consistently. And so the egg police remove all the drone eggs that got laid in worker cells because they didn't happen to get fertilized, and so it looks really spotty. So that's sometimes the sign that the queen's failing. And then when she completely fails, then she's laying nothing but drones, and then they may actually out of frustration or whatever, they'll actually start raising those drones. So one of the ways to tell them apart is, first of all, obviously, if you see the queen, then you know, and there's lots, and it's all drones, then you have a drone laying queen. But if you see a lot of multiple eggs, and by multiple, I don't mean like doubles or triples, I mean like 5, 10 eggs in a cell, then you've got laying workers. So if you've got a drone laying queen, the best solution is to find her if you can. Because if you can find her and remove her, that's a lot better guarantee than if you can't. But if you can't find her, if you just keep giving them a frame of eggs and brood, open brood, there's a good chance they'll supersede her because they'll realize she's failing, and now you've given them the means to fix the problem. So ideally, I would say look for the queen and try to find her. But if you fail to find her, you can just give them eggs and brood. Now, if you have, again, if you're raising queens and you got queen cells around, give them a queen cell by all means, because that will speed everything up. It'll go off as a supersedure because the queen cell will emerge. Now, what I wouldn't do is don't go buy a queen and try to introduce her. If you've got a drone laying queen and you can't find her, they'll just kill the queen you try to introduce because it's still not their queen. But if you give them some eggs, they may raise the queen. So let's talk about laying workers. I think this is one of the most misunderstood things in beekeeping. If you watch a colony turn into a laying worker colony, you'll see this goes in steps and stages, and at different stages you may be able to pull off different solutions. So let's just talk about the cause. So the cause of them being laying workers is that there's a lack of open worker brood. Open worker brood suppresses the development of the ovaries in the workers. So if there's no open brood for too long, they'd start developing ovaries. Now, this is obviously a bit of an oversimplification because obviously my hives tend to be broodless for at least 3 or 4 months in the winter, and they don't turn into laying workers, where in the summer, if they were queenless for 3 or 4 months, they definitely develop laying workers. It pretty much, if they're broodless for a month, they're pretty good risk of turning into laying workers. And that doesn't happen in the winter. So there's obviously some other mechanisms involved that have to do with the natural reason they've shut down brood rearing in the winter, as opposed to the artificial situation that the queen's no longer laying workers and worker brood, which is suppressing the ovaries in the workers. But anyway, that is the fundamental cause, though, is the lack of pheromones from the open brood. And if the first thing that'll happen is you'll start seeing really spotty eggs and brood. So this is one of those situations where if you're especially if you're a new beekeeper and you've never seen this before, you get in your hive and you're trying to figure out if they're queen right, and you see an egg, one egg, none around it, just this one egg by itself, and then somewhere over here on a different spot on that same comb you find another egg, and you go, oh well, I must have a queen. I wouldn't consider that I necessarily have a queen unless I see a pattern of eggs. Now, if I got even a 2-inch or 3-inch diameter space that's all filled with eggs, then I probably have a queen. But if I've got an egg over here and an egg over there and an egg somewhere else, and maybe even a larva somewhere, that doesn't mean I have a queen. That probably means I have laying workers, because that's typically what you see. They're laying eggs, but what's happening is, first of all, there's not that many of them yet, and there's enough egg police to remove all the drone eggs that are in the worker cells. So because they're keeping up, it's mixed information. You might think that you have a queen because you don't see a lot of drone caps yet, because they haven't even capped any of them yet. And you don't see, and you do see an egg here and there. So that makes you think maybe I have a queen, but actually you don't. If you had a queen, she'd be laying it in a solid area. You know, she would be laying an egg in every cell in a confined area maybe at first, but eventually it would spread out more. So the other thing that they often will do at this stage is they'll try to raise a queen from one of these haploid drone larvae that are in the worker cell. They'll build a queen cell, and quite often they'll build it, they'll cap it, the whole shebang. And you may look at it and see an egg here and there, this maybe one capped drone cell over here, and a couple of larvae, and a queen cell. And you think, oh, well, good, they're fixing it because they're building the queen cell. But they're really not. At this point, you could do almost anything. At that point where they're building the queen cells, you could introduce a queen, you could introduce a queen cell, you could give them a frame of brood and let them raise a queen, because they're trying to raise a queen. They're just trying to do it with the only thing they have, which is a drone larva, and it's not going to work. They're smart enough, though, if you give them some worker larva, they know the difference, and they'll start raising one from the worker larva, most likely. I can't say bees will always do anything, because anybody who says that hasn't been keeping bees very long. But the next stage, as it proceeds a little more, is that you'll start seeing multiple eggs in cells. At first, maybe just a couple, but very quickly it grows to 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 in a cell. And the other thing they like to do is that the laying workers like to lay in drone cells, because they can get their butt far enough down into the cell to lay the egg on the bottom. And they'll start laying eggs on top of pollen because they can reach it. And the other thing you'll see on a worker cell is quite often they'll lay eggs on the side of the cell instead of the bottom of the cell, because they can't reach the bottom. So those are all symptoms that would lead you to believe you've got laying workers. Now, at this point, when you're starting to see multiple eggs, introducing a queen is not going to work. It's probably going to get your queen killed. It's very unlikely to work. Now, a queen cell has a pretty good chance of working. This is the point at which, though, that most people realize they've got laying workers, and they try the old idea of shaking them out. Well, the only reason to shake bees out when they're laying workers is just to get them out of the colony and let them move into somewhere else, because shaking them out is not going to get them to accept a queen. It might contribute a little bit. You might get lucky, and 1 out of 10 times, maybe you can get them to accept a queen after you shook them out, just because you disrupted them so much that they're distracted and they're not paying attention to the queen. They're just too distracted with all the other hubbub you created by shaking them out. But 9 times out of 10, they're going to kill that queen. The idea was that the laying workers don't know their way home. I guarantee you all the laying workers know their way home. And at the point where you're seeing multiple eggs, half the bees in the colony are laying workers. Thousands of them are laying workers. And if you go to my website and go to beekeeping, go down the left-hand side to pests and whatever, and go to laying work. Oh no, I guess it's just under the general stuff, but go to laying workers and go look. I've got links to the research that will tell you that literally half the bees in your colony are laying workers when you're at this point. So what's the solution? Well, if it's in my outyard, well, here's another thing you might want to look out for. Sometimes when you just introduce the queen, you'll see some doubles, even some triples now and then. But that's just because she hasn't got the hang of what she's doing, or they haven't cleaned out enough cells for her. And she's got all these eggs, and she wants to put them someplace, and they haven't cleaned out enough cells for her to lay in. And sometimes a new queen just getting started will do that, but don't be misled. So if you're in an outyard, it takes too many trips to try and resolve this, and especially if it's a weak colony, then there's really no point. And a lot of times it is, because a lot of times it has been dwindling for a while before it turned laying workers and you didn't realize it. So it's often to your advantage just to move the equipment, pick up all the boxes and move them, it doesn't matter, 10, 20 yards, far enough away that they won't think they won't find it right away. And then shake all the bees off of the combs. And by shake, I mean, well, if the comb's good and solid, you might be able to pound them off by Miller's method. Just grab a hold of the top bar and hit your hand and knock them off. Or if the comb looks fragile, brush them off. But one way or another, just get all the bees off of the equipment. And as you get them off of a frame, take it over and put it far enough away from where you just shook them off so they don't just get back on it. And just do that till you get all the bees off, and then put all those frames back in the boxes you took them out of, and then put those boxes on top of some strong hives and let them take care of it. That's the simplest, but but you've lost a colony. Now, if you've got a fairly strong colony that's laying workers, which occasionally happens, I wouldn't say that's the norm. I'd say normally a laying worker hive is usually not very strong and probably not worth trying to turn it around. But if you're a hobbyist and you only have one hive or two hives, it might be important to you to try to turn it around. Well, if you only have one hive, you're out of luck unless you can get some brood from somebody, because the solution then is, the best solution I know of is to get some open brood and give them open brood every week for 3 weeks. Usually by the end of 3 weeks, you've set back the laying workers because of the pheromones from the open brood, and they've got the means to start a queen. So once they start queen cells, you can give them one more frame of open brood just to make sure it keeps them going until that queen gets mated. But you probably don't need to keep doing it every week after that. Just do it that one time when you find a queen cell, and they'll usually raise a queen and get back, and they may get back on their feet. I'm not gonna say they're always gonna get back on their feet, because here's the problem. All these bees have gotten old in the meantime. So you haven't had a queen laying for at least 3 weeks or more in order for them to start becoming laying workers. So it may be a month by the time you start giving them a frame of brood every week. Now, the frame of brood gave them some young bees, but meanwhile, all the other bees in the colony are already a month old, and they're only going to live a couple of more weeks. So you need to take that into account, because it may not help as much as you think. But if you give them a frame of brood every week for 3 weeks, they have been getting some new young bees from that. So they may make it through and get back on their feet. Anyway, there are other things you can try, but I think the open brood is by far your best bet. Now, the other things kind of depend on whether you are raising queens. If you're raising queens and you've got a queen cell, you can do that. Or if you're inspecting a hive and they're trying to swarm, and meanwhile this other one is laying workers, you can give them a queen cell out of a hive that's trying to swarm, and that may turn them around. I've had it work, I've had it fail. I can't say it. The open brood is almost 100% successful if there's enough bees to keep the colony going, so it doesn't collapse from just old bees. But the queen cell, I'd say it's more like better than 50-50, but not nowhere near 100%. Maybe 60 to 70% solution. Now, I've done this before, and I think part of it is, again, the confusion. If you take 2 or 3 laying worker hives that are weak, and this usually happens to me because they're mating nukes or they're just a nuke that just ended up queenless, and you put all 3 of these together to create a total amount of confusion, and then put those on a strong hive, sometimes that works out all right. But it may be safer just to shake them out, because if you shake them out, they have to beg their way in, and then they don't tend to be aggressive. Where I definitely would not take a laying worker hive and just put it on top of a strong hive, because then it's a them or us thing, where you've got the laying worker hive sees themselves as one group and the strong hive sees themselves as the other group. Where if you take 2 or 3, mix them together, it's more of a chaos. It's not them or us, it's a whole bunch of confusion, and confusion's your friend whenever you're doing a combine. So let's talk about some of the myths. One of them is that the cause of laying workers is being queenless. Well, that is an indirect cause of laying workers because it's a lack of brood that causes the laying workers, and the lack of brood is caused by the lack of a queen. So there is a connection, but it's important to realize that that's not the direct connection, or you wouldn't realize that open brood will solve your problem. The reason open brood will solve your problem is that it's not the queenlessness that's the problem, it's the lack of open brood. So you can give them open brood where you can't introduce a queen because they'll just kill her. From their point of view, they think they have a queen. They've got thousands of laying workers, and all of those laying workers are producing a little tiny bit of queen pheromone. And so they think they have a queen. They're wrong, but they kind of think they do. Now, back to that sequence when I was talking about when it starts and they're still building queen cells, then they know they're queenless. At that point, you could have introduced a queen. But once they start thinking that they aren't queenless, then it's really difficult. This is a quote from The Wisdom of the Hive on queen pheromones and the fact that it's not the queen pheromones that suppress the laying workers. This is and I'd let you read more of this, but I probably won't get all the way done if I spend too long on it. But again, there's a whole page on laying workers on my website, and you can read all of this, and I have links to other studies as well. Another myth is that there's only one laying worker, and like I said before, that actually half your bees are laying workers by the time you have tons of those. The other thing is that a queen right hive has laying workers. It's probably got maybe 100 in a typical queen right hive, but usually the egg police just remove all the eggs that didn't belong in the worker cells, and if they lay a few in the drone cells and they don't remove them, it doesn't matter. So this is actually they're saying that they dissected 10,634 worker bees and found 7 that were laying workers, and these are all queen right colonies. So there's not a lot of laying workers, but if there's 7 in a 10,000 bee hive, then 7 out of 10,000. If you have a 50,000 bee hive, you've got 35 laying workers. If you've got 100,000, then you've got 70 laying workers. So that's 70 laying workers in a booming hive of 100,000, and that's a queen right hive. So the idea that there's one laying worker in there and that you're just trying to get rid of her is not true. The other myth is that if you shake them out, they can't find their way back. I've tried this myself, came to that conclusion. There have been a few studies since then that I found that also came to the same conclusion. So let's talk about robbing. The best way to deal with robbing is to make sure it doesn't happen. I know that's not terribly helpful once it is happening, but the fact is, if you're in a dearth and you're inspecting hives and there's a lot of bees showing an interest and a lot of agitated bees around while you're working, they're probably trying to rob that hive you're working on. And if you let them rob them too much, it could set off a frenzy. And once you get a robbing frenzy going, it's really difficult to turn around. So I'm going to tell you some things that may help, but the fact is, you need to stop it as quickly as you can, and it really helps if you can avoid it. So what I'm saying is, if you're starting to inspect hives and you're starting to see bees interested in robbing, the best thing you may be able to do for your bees is close them up and leave them alone. Now, I realize sometimes that's difficult because you have a goal that you need to get done and you think you need to get that goal done, but sometimes you're just going to have to put that goal off. Another thing you can do to kind of prevent it is wait until late in the day to do anything, so the bees are all coming home and they're not all out foraging. So in other words, like a half hour before sunset, go do whatever it is you think you absolutely have to do, even though there's a dearth. rather than do it in the middle of the day when everybody's out foraging and the robbers quickly find it because there's nothing out there for them to forage on. They're just all looking for stuff. They're looking for anything they can get. Now, how do you know that they're in that kind of mood? Well, one of the clues is if you've got bottom entrances, which I don't, you have a landing board, which I don't, you'll see a lot of wrestling on the landing board. That's a pretty good clue that they're trying to rob each other. They may not be succeeding, but they're attempting it. But the other one is when you're inspecting and there's a lot of agitation and a lot of bees wrestling around on the top bars, then you probably just need to close them up and walk away. That's your best bet. Just because once you get a frenzy going, it's really hard to stop. So another prevention you can do is keep your entrances small all the time. I recommend having them small all the time. Mine are about 3/8 of an inch tall and 2 inches wide all year round. Actually, might be 1.5 inches, about 1.5 inches wide by 3/8 of an inch tall. I used to open them up in the summer and close them down in the winter, or whenever there wasn't a lot of traffic. But the more I've watched the ones I didn't get around to opening up and the ones that were open all the time, the more I've concluded that a small entrance is much better for the bees all the way around. They're less likely to get robbing started because they can defend it, and they're less likely to have other issues with things like small hive beetles. The more defensible that entrance is, the more they can keep the small hive beetles out, the more they can keep the wax moths out. It's just better for the bees all the way around. And they get really good at managing the traffic. If you watch them, even with just 1.5 inch wide entrance, they'll get the traffic flowing really well. They'll have them coming in on one side, going out on the other, and just, really moving traffic. Yeah, I don't have any bottom entrances. I just have top entrances. Maybe that's not quite true because the pallets I built that I have my bees on now, I kept getting too much water problems, and so I ended up drilling holes in the corners. And I tried to keep them small enough the bees couldn't get in and out, but that wouldn't seem to get the water out. So I ended up with holes a little bit bigger than a bee before I could get where they would stay drained. So sometimes they can get in and out the bottom, but not that much. At 3/8 of an inch is tall enough for every bee, drones, queens, whatever. I've also noticed that queenless hives get robbed a lot. So while I used to set up my mating nukes the day before and then put cells in them the next day, I find I get robbed a lot less if I make up the mating nuke and put a cell in it immediately. And there's something about a queen cell, especially one that's close to emerging, like 2 days from emerging, that the bees don't sense themselves as queenless, and the outside bees don't sense them as queenless. A queenless hive, well, first of all, it makes a different sound. If you've ever listened to them, a queenless hive makes a different sound. But second of all, a queenless hive smells different, both to the bees that live there and the bees that don't live there. And I've noticed if I make up a queenless nuke or they'll get robbed almost immediately if there's any kind of dearth. Now it works okay if there's not a dearth and there's plenty of a flow, then the bees are just busy foraging and they don't pay attention. But you really got to keep an eye on it if you've got a queenless hive and there's a dearth, because they sense that and they start robbing them. Of course, the other problem is that once they start robbing them, they may make them queenless. So if they're not queenless and they start robbing them, they'll often kill the queen. So the first thing you want to do is make sure they're actually being robbed before you start doing drastic things. But this is one of those things where it's difficult to describe it and have you understand it perfectly. But once you've seen both of them, it's kind of obvious. So every afternoon during brood rearing season, if it's a sunny day anyway, there'll be an orientation flight. Around here, it's usually like 1 or 2 in the afternoon. You'll see a whole bunch of young bees hovering around the hive. So the thing you want to look for to distinguish this is robbers tend to be shiny and orientation flights are fuzzy. The bees are fuzzy. They're young bees. They're still fuzzy. They're not shiny. Where robbers are often shiny. In fact, sometimes robbers are downright black because the other bees will pull their hair, and the hair is where the color is. And if they pull their hair, they end up black. And so sometimes robbers are black from being attacked and having their hair pulled. I don't know how many of you have had the Russian bees, but one of the things you'll notice about Russian bees is they like to pull your hair. It's a defense mechanism that bees use. And my experience with the Russians is they seem to be defensive in odd ways. They'll pull my hair, they'll get tangled in my hair trying to pull it because I've got really curly beard. And then of course, then they start burrowing in and try and sting you, but they usually don't try and sting me until they feel like I'm trying to trap them in my beard. But they'll actually grab a strand of hair and pull it. But anyway, that's what robbers will do to other bees. I mean, the bees that are defending will do to the robbers. They'll pull their hair. So one of the things you're looking for to distinguish robbers from orienting bees is the orienting bees are fuzzy. Even that little black spot usually in the middle of their back, it'll be all fuzzy, just like a newly emerged bee is all fuzzy. The other thing is they're hovering. They're usually not really frantic. If you look at robbers are always frantic. They're agitated. They're not calm. These bees that are orienting, they're hovering around and they're kind of doing little circles, and you know they're calm. They're not frantic. So that's one way to distinguish it. Another way is that if it's the bees that live there, they're all going to come home at dark, and they'll be inside. So if you close up all the entrances after dark, and a whole bunch of bees show up first thing in the morning, those are robbers. So that's another way you could do it. But the problem is, unless you just notice this almost at sundown, you don't want to let them be robbing for a whole day because it'll just get more and more out of hand. It turns into this frenzy. So another thing you're looking for robbing is the wrestling I mentioned before, and that's what I was saying about closing them up. But so I think the most important thing if they're being robbed is to stop it as fast as you can. One of the old methods is to get a bed sheet wet and put it over the hive, because the wet bed sheet, especially in the summer, is helpful in a lot of ways because it provides a certain amount of cooling, which is the problem if you close a hive up. They have the problem that they can't go gather water and evaporate it to cool it. So there's that problem. So the sheet will stop anybody from getting in and out because it kind of blocks everybody's path. So it'll stop everybody, including the ones that live there, but the robbers may give up eventually and go home. This is part of the problem. This is part of what you're trying to accomplish when you close them up, is to get the robbers to give up. The bees that live there aren't going to give up. You don't have to worry about them. It's the robbers you got to get to give up. One of the things you can do is get some just window screen and staple it over the entrance and block it completely, and wait until the robbers give up, and then come back and poke a hole in it just big enough for one bee to get in and out. I won't guarantee any of these things will work, because sometimes the bees are so determined and the dearth is so strong that nothing seems to dissuade them once a real frenzy breaks out. Now you can usually do things if you can catch it before it's really a frenzy. If it's just that there's a little bit of fighting on the landing boards, and a little bit of wrestling and some of that going on, then you could start taking steps at that point and probably head this off. But once they're really, really insanely robbing each other, that frenzy is really difficult to stop. So the other thing is the robbers are trying to get in every little nook and cranny of the hive. So they're like every corner and every place there's any smell at all, they're trying to get in, even though there's no way in there. Where the bees that live there know how to get in and out, and they don't do that. So that's another way to distinguish them. But that's also something you got to keep an eye on when you're trying to close them off, is every little corner that has a hole big enough for a bee to get in and out, the robbers will find it. So you may have to screen off more than just the entrance. You may have to catch some of those other damaged spots on the colony to stop them. So number 8 has some advantages because the robbers keep trying to get through it and they really can't. But window screen's easier to come by, and that's what I usually use when I'm just trying to close it all off immediately. Some of this depends on the scale of your operation. If you've got one hive that's getting robbed and you're trying to solve its problems, you can put a lot of effort into this. You could actually like put a feeder in there that's got some water in it so they can still cool the hive. You could, you know, and that's a big problem with closing them down in the summer, is they have to cool the hive. And if you close off the entrance, they can't haul water. And if they can't haul water, they can't evaporate it to cool the hive. So you can't close them off for very long. This is the wet sheet method. I can't say I've ever actually done it, but it's not a bad idea. But another variation on that is you haul the hose out there and you put a sprinkler on them, because the sprinkler makes them all think it's raining and they all go home. And that's pretty useful. Now, I've never had the nerve to try Jim Fisher's method, which is you just go pull the lids off all the hives, and that way the robbers have to stay home to guard their own hive. Another way that you could do this, though, is if you've got one hive being robbed, if you take some flour or powdered sugar or whatever and sprinkle it over the bees that are robbing there, and then start looking for where those ghost bees that are now all white, looking for where they go, those are the strong hives that are robbing that hive. You can pull their lids off. That I might be willing to do, because I'm just a little too paranoid of the weak ones being left open. That's the Jim Fisher method there. A robber screen is pretty useful. Now that I went to top entrances, I really don't have any, and I haven't built any. I probably should. This basically works on the principle that the robbers are looking for, they're following smell. Even if this entrance looks just like their entrance, they're not smart enough to figure that out. What they're looking for is smell. And so if you put a screen over the entrance and there's a way around the screen, the bees that live there will find the way around the screen, where the robbers will just keep pestering the screen trying to get through. So this is the one I built. I actually bought these as screen doors from Brushy Mountain. They were made to close up a hive to move it, and I turned it into a robber screen. But I noticed shortly after I posted this on my website, Brushy Mountain started selling ones with the notch up there, and then they put a up there where the notch is. You see my pointer? Here's where the notch is. They started putting a little metal thing with a pivot on it so you could open that up, and then you could close it and use it as a screen door, or you could open it up and use it as a robber screen, which I thought was pretty brilliant of them. But anyway, these worked pretty well. If you, the ones that, who is it? University of UC Davis has one you can probably find online. If you look up robber screen and UC Davis on Google or DuckDuckGo or whatever, you'll probably find it. And basically they just took number 8 hardware cloth and left it open at the top completely, not just one little opening there, but left it completely open at the top and just blocked the main entrance. And so the bees, it was on a bottom, of course, so the bees would, the robber bees would go where they could smell the entrance, and they're like 4 inches below the top. If they just go up 4 inches and go over, they could go in, but they don't. They're just going for the smell. They're going directly for the smell, and apparently they don't find their way up and over, even though it's open all the way across the top. This is the back side. I probably didn't need to make it this small, but it basically reduced the entrance going into the hive to just a quarter, half inch, I guess, at the bottom and a half inch at the top. And so they have to come in one side, go across, and then go down to go in the other side. And usually the robbers then just would pile up on the screen. This is one, when somebody first told me this, I thought it was insane. And then I tried it because I had an observation hive and it was really difficult to reduce the entrance. So I tried it. I just put fixed vapor rub around it and it really made a difference. The robbers just gave up and went home. The bees that live there know their way in, so they don't pay attention to the smell, but the robbers are always being driven by smell. They're looking for the smell of a colony or the smell of the honey. And once all they can smell is Vicks vapor rub, they give up. Sometimes your best bet is to take a couple of these weak hives and combine them. Of course, the problem is if they're already being robbed, there's already all this fighting going on, that may not quite be enough to change things. So sometimes your best bet is to not just combine them, but to move them. So they take the 2 weak hives, move them somewhere else and do a newspaper combine on them. Because if you move them to a whole different spot, preferably 2 miles away, then none of the robbers can find them. If you can't get that far away, even if you went 100 yards away, it'll probably make some difference. So let's talk about another issue. People open up their hive and they see a bunch of queen cells and they freak. I think part of the problem is they've read books that talk about destroying swarm cells to prevent swarming, which I think is a terrible way to prevent swarming. I tried it when I first got started because I was dirt poor and all the books in our little small town library were from the 1800s. So I read a lot of C.C. Miller and G.M. Doolittle because I was too poor to buy any books. So I read everything in the library, and all of them were always destroying queen cells to control swarming. They'd go in once a week and destroy every queen cell in the colony. Here's the problem though. If you've got a capped queen cell and they're swarming, they probably already swarmed because right after they cap the first one is usually when they swarm. So let's talk a minute, since I got a nice picture here, about what I see here. So what I see here is this one's capped, this one's open, and not even drawn that far. This one's capped, this one's capped, this one's open, this one's open. So my point is that these are all different age cells. When they swarm, they make a bunch of different age cells because their intent is to swarm and after swarm and after swarm and after swarm until they think the population is where it ought to be, and then they'll tear down the rest of the cells. So they stagger them in age on purpose. Now, if this was an emergency or a supersedure, they tend to all be pretty much the same age. They might vary, they might be a day apart, maybe even 2 days apart, but they're not a week apart. These are a week apart between this one, which is probably just started, and this one, which is totally capped, and these, which look like they were capped a while ago. These are all different ages, and they're at least a week apart. So my point is, we've got to decide why these cells are here before we can figure out what we want to do. So this is a myth that queen cells are bad and you should destroy them. The fact is, the queen cells are there for a reason. You need to know what the reason is. The other thing is that part of this whole philosophy was always that the wild bees were mean and not good, and that you wanted a good Italian queen in there. And that may have been true at the time, but at this point in time, I think the wild bees are much better than the ones you buy. The gene pool of the ones you buy is so narrow that the hardiness is gone. The feral bees still have some of that hardiness. I don't want those store-bought queens. I want hardy feral bees. So what we wanted is, well, first of all, let's talk about the results. So you go in and destroy all the queen cells. Well, if they were trying to swarm, then they probably already swarmed if they were capped, and now they don't have any means to replace the queen. And if they were superseding and you destroyed them, the queen is about to fail, and you just remove their only hope of getting a queen to replace her. So what do you want to do? Well, there are people who say you don't want to use swarm cells because you'll get swarmy bees if you keep using swarm cells. I disagree with that to a certain extent, because I think there is such a thing as swarmy bees. To me, swarmy bees are bees that swarm when they have no good reason to swarm, like in the middle of a dearth, or they swarm and after swarm and after swarm and after swarm until there's no bees left and then the colony fails. Those are swarmy bees. But bees that swarm when they should be swarming, when it's swarm season, when the colony is doing well, they're just doing what every creature on the planet does, which is reproduce itself. I don't consider that swarmy bees. That's just successful bees. I like to breed from successful bees. So if I see swarm cells, they're always well fed. They're always made under the best conditions, because that's what the bees are planning on. They purposely made lots of drones, so there'd be lots of drones out there during the swarm season. And they purposely timed swarm season for when there's lots of resources to feed the bees, to feed the queens well. So the queens are well fed, they're going to get well bred, and that's the best kind of queens I can get. So my theory is if they're trying to swarm, I'm going to take advantage of the cells. I can give some to a queenless colony. I can give some to a laying worker colony. I can put some in some mating nukes, or I can just split it several ways. I tend to split it so every frame that's got some cells on it goes in its own colony, and I split it. I call it splitting it to the four winds, because I make as many splits as I can. Now, they may not all build up, but I get a whole bunch of good queens out of the deal. And some of them will build up and do well. So now let's just talk about messed up combs. So you open up a colony and the combs are all messed up. The fact is, most bees try to build parallel combs. And so usually if you give them a hint with a comb guide or a piece of foundation or whatever, and you space them so that there's no wasted space between them, they will tend to build them in your frames. But once in a while, you get some bees that just have a wild hair. They just want to build everything every which way. I think that's, if they're doing a lot of that, it's probably just genetics. You probably just don't want to breed from those bees. But there are things you can do to stack the deck to try and get straight comb. So you need to try and figure out why they messed it up. One of the reasons they'll mess it up is because you have them spaced too wide. I don't know why they don't talk about this in any of the beginner books, but you should always put all your frames tight together in the middle of the box. Do not space them out evenly. Do not space them out more. Now, once you have drawn comb in a super, you could space them out more, because when they're doing honey, they don't care how thick the comb is, and they'll make it thicker. So you can end up with 8 frames in a 10 frame box, and they'll just make the combs thicker, which makes them easier to uncap, and you need less frames, and that's all nice. But if you put foundation up there or foundationless and space it 8 frames to a 10 frame box, they will make a mess because you gave them the freedom to do it. Once they have drawn comb, they tend to just make it thicker. But if they don't have drawn comb, there's no telling what they'll do if you give them too much space. So you should always put them tight together. I actually shave mine down, and I put 9 frames in an 8 frame box. I put 11 frames in a 10 frame box back when I had 10 frame boxes, which I don't have anymore. So my frames are all 1 1/4 inches. I say all, that's not quite true, because I do have some PF 100s or 120s from Man Lake that are small cell plastic, and they're 1 1 3/8, which is the standard width. Just because I never got around to cutting them down. I'd love to cut them down, but I probably won't find the time. So part of it is if you give them more space, they'll mess it up more. So you don't want to do that. And if you give them more space with drawn comb, if I put that drawn comb in a brood nest and space them out wider, then I'll get very uneven comb because they'll draw the honey out to within 1/4 of an inch of the next frame or the next comb. And they won't do that with the brood because the brood has to be a specific depth for the larva to develop correctly. So brood comb is one depth and honey is a variable depth. So if I space them out more in the brood nest, they'll just make it uneven if it's already drawn. If it's not already drawn, they may actually draw combs in between and ignore my foundation because bees are not really attracted to foundation. They don't really like foundation. If you give them space to build comb without the foundation, they will do that every time. So another thing that drives them to do what they do is if they're building their own comb, it's actually following the standard method they use when they draw a comb, which is you have bees hanging from both sides. You have bees hanging from in a catenary arch, really, and you have bees working from both sides that are communicating because as at the edge of the construction here, the bees are actually going back and forth between as they work on this cell. And then they're actually communicating through the bottom of the cell because they scrape this bottom of the cell down so thin that there's a bee on both sides doing the scraping or it'll break through. And then sometimes they break through anyway and have to rebuild it and scrape it down again. So it's a communication going on between the two sides that is often being communicated around the edge and through both sides. Now, this is one of the reasons I don't think they ever liked, the bees never liked Duracomb or what's the other one? I had Duracomb, but there's another one that's the same thing except it's got Duragilt, that's the other one. So Duragilt and Duracomb are both on, they took a sheet of plastic and put wax on both sides and pressed it, but the bees never liked it. I could never get them to draw it very well unless they just had no choice. Because I think the problem is they want to make the bottom of that cell that thin and communicate back and forth. And they've got this piece of plastic that just won't give. They end up getting all the way down to the plastic and they still can't get it as thin as they want. So even though it's wax and wax, you would think they would like it, but it's that piece of plastic in the middle that they don't like. And then there's the cell size. They have an idea of what they want to build. They either want to build some drone or they want to build some worker or they want to build some honey storage. And when you give them foundation, you've decided what the cell size is, and it may not be the one they had in their head that they wanted to build. So I've always seen them build foundationless with more enthusiasm than they build on foundation. So one of the reasons they mess it up is they're trying to avoid building on your foundation. They usually don't like too much plastic too much. If you want them to draw plastic, you really have to get them in a position where there's no other choice. In other words, that doesn't mean you can't mix honey, you can't mix plastic and wax. But what it does mean is if you give them plastic and wax, they're going to build the wax first. If you give them plastic and wax foundationless, they're going to build the foundationless first. So it's not that they won't draw it, but if all the wax is already drawn and you've got a plastic one in here, they'll draw it because it's the only place left to build. But as long as there's someplace else to build, they're going to tend to skip it. So if you get an out of place comb, and actually I see these almost all the time because of the way people install their packages. So they'll install a package and hang the queen between two frames, and they'll all hang from the queen cage, and they'll build a comb right there hanging from the queen cage between two combs almost every time. So now I have this comb and it's not in the frame. And sometimes they'll do that just because you space them too wide and they could build one in between. So if you get a comb that's in between, sometimes they're too soft to do anything with, but if it's got brood in it and it doesn't have nectar in it, usually no matter how soft it is, I can probably cut it if I'm really gentle and rubber band it into a frame, just an empty frame. If it's too small, it's probably not worth the effort. If it's too heavy with nectar, and it's really soft, it's not worth the effort. But otherwise, you probably can. Now, this is my problem when I have a top bar hive, is I almost always have to build some frames to go in my top bar hive, because if the comb falls off, I want to be able to rubber band it back in and put it in there. And a frame lets me do that. So most of my top bar hives, I have frames. Some of you were posting the question on how well top bar hives work in the north. I usually have at least one top bar hive with bees in it. Sometimes I have as many as 2 or 3. I don't do a lot of top bar hives. It takes more management, and I don't have time to mess with them too much. But they're kind of fun to have around. They survive my winters just as well as the vertical hives. I don't really see a lot of difference. I do things maybe a little different than some top bar hive people do. For one thing, I always put the entrance on the end because I want the brood nest to be on the end, because then when they start eating honey, I want them to start at one end and work their way to the other end. Where if I have the entrance in the middle, then they build the brood nest in the middle and they have honey on both ends, and then they'll work their way to one end, and then they'll starve to death with food at the other end. So I always put the entrance at one end. And I always put the entrance at the top at one end. I don't have any bottom entrance at all. And then they do a lot better if you insulate the top. I don't usually insulate the whole hive, but I insulate the top, because that's where you'll get condensation, is at the top. So and you want to prevent the condensation. Now, generally the combs kind of spread out right at the top anyway, so they sort of merge right at the top, so that there's usually not the same thing you get with a inner cover, where it's condensing on the inner cover and then dripping down. You usually don't get that anyway on a top bar hive, so it's usually not a big problem. So if I've got some means to do it, if a comb's messed up in the top bar hive and I have a frame, I can just cut it out and put it in the frame. This is a typical one I get from new beekeepers. They freak out because there's all these bees on the outside and they think they're about to swarm. Well, bees bearding is not a sign that they're about to swarm. It's a sign that they're doing well and that there's lots of bees, and it's probably also a sign that it's hot, but it's not necessarily a sign they're going to swarm. Now, some of those things I just listed that it is a sign of, though, are things that could lead to swarming. If they're too crowded, yes, that could lead to swarming. But quite often they're not outside just because it's too crowded, it's because it's too hot. So bees bearding, I think of it as, it's like people sweating, and when they're hot, it's what they do. So don't lose any sleep over it, but it's probably worth taking a look inside and see how the colony's doing, because odds are they're doing well, and if they're doing well, there is a chance that they're doing too well and they're about to swarm. But I'm just saying, you can have a hive that's bearding all summer long and they didn't swarm. So it doesn't mean they're going to swarm. It just means that they're outside. Is it possible they're going to swarm? Sure, that's possible. But I'm just saying, it's just because they're bearding does not mean they're going to swarm. But it might be worth taking a look inside and see what's going on. Actually, another reason to take a look inside and see what's going on is I've noticed you'll see a lot of them on the outside, and they'll be acting agitated when they're being taken over by small hive beetles. So if I see a whole bunch of bees on the outside of the hive, I usually do take a look inside and see what I see, because it could be that the small hive beetles are taking over, and that's why they're on the outside. So I've kicked this around, and I've really meant to do some experiments on it, but I don't seem to ever find time to do them. But I would like to know, if I take steps that all the bees move back inside, did I help them or did I cause more work for them and they all had to go inside to do the work? Because bees have to cool a hive. And if I create a whole lot of ventilation and it's hot outside, I may actually be causing more work for them, because they still have to cool it. And now I just left the door open. It's like they're trying to air condition the hive and I just left the door wide open. So I want to make sure they've got enough ventilation, but I don't want to give them too much ventilation. And I think people often get carried away with ventilation. Now, they do have to evaporate the water when they're making honey, so it's a good idea to let that moist air out. It's one of the reasons I run all top entrances is moist air rises, and I want to let it out. But I also want the bees to be in charge of the ventilation and not me, because they know more what they're doing than I do. And they've been living in trees with very small entrances for a very long time and doing quite well. So there's more on almost every one of these topics on my website. You can go read about robbing and laying workers and queenlessness and so on. And if you don't find the topic on the main menu, because there's quite a few on the main menu, if you go to frequently asked questions, I've got a whole bunch of them that are just quick, here's the cause, here's the explanation kind of things. And then I have a whole page on fallacies of what people believe that I don't think is true. So all of that's on my website. This is my contact information, bees@bushfarms.com. I code that because I get these letters from these Russian women who all want to meet me. And because the spam bots go look for these on files that are on the web, and all of my presentations are out there on the web. So you can look at them, but anyway, that's my website. That's my YouTube channel. I don't have very many things that I posted, but there's a lot of my speaking that's been recorded by other people and posted out there that I also have links to there. If you want to be a patron, I kind of left Patreon. I'm still on Patreon, I guess, but I'm mostly focused on locals now. I have a place where you can support my work if you want. And then these are 3 of my books: The Practical Beekeeper, The Practical Queen Breeder, Beekeeping Naturally, A Simple Recipe. The idea of beekeeping naturally was The Practical Beekeeper is pretty much my website where I talk about all kinds of things, and I give you all your options for anything it is you want to think about. I had a lot of people that pushed me to go to write a book that just tell them if I were doing it now, what would I do, instead of here's all your choices. And so that's kind of what A Simple Recipe is. Beekeeping naturally. A simple recipe is pretty much, if I were starting beekeeping today, this is what I'd buy, instead of telling you what all your options are. And this is how I'd go about it, instead of telling what.
I think we might have lost some of the connection there for Michael. Give him a second to see if he comes back in. So let me finish up and conclude with everybody by giving you an overview of the Sustainable Beekeepers Guild of Michigan. Facebook group is open to everybody. It is an open forum. You don't have to be a member of the club to participate in that forum. We also have the Facebook group for the Michigan treatment-free beekeepers. It was a little bit of a different posting and conversation policy between the 2 groups, but the reason for that is clear and laid out in those policies on those particular venues. We want to remind you about some of the efforts that we're hoping to aim for with our queen breeding and nuke exchange program for beekeepers. We want to be able to establish a network and a co-op of beekeepers that are practicing a lot of the things that you're hearing and experiencing today, so that others can benefit from the genetics in the region and also improving the genetics in your region. I like to say I'm not an altruistic beekeeper. I want you to have better bees so that your better bees are helping my bees be better also. I probably will never say that the same way twice. We are also working on a mentor group network development. You know, we want other beekeepers to have access to mentors who are, you know, providing treatment-free and chemical-free practices. And it's not just the chemical-free, treatment-free aspect of beekeeping, but you're learning basic hive management. You're learning what you need to do when it comes to splitting. You're learning about bee biology, and you're getting hands-on frame time. And then Terry had mentioned that we're discussing how to create a hive or badge program for beginners. We want you guys to be able to earn a hive. You know, the Bee Guild has a plan for you to complete these processes. And at the end of this period of apprenticeship, you not only get the badge of honor of having had completed that, but we'll provide you with your first nuke. We'll give you your first set of bees, and we'll give you some good bees. All right. We also want to encourage you to reach out to us. Send me an email, send me a text, whatever you need to do. Stop by the webpage for the Guild, shoot us future speaker and topic recommendations. And the last thing I wanted to cover is that we're working on a forum for individuals to come together and share, other than the Facebook venue, not that that's not sufficient, but a sustainable beekeeping guild where people can come together and they can express their views and opinions, and they can share like-mindedness in these efforts without having to face the barrels of some of the more mainline forums where you can easily get distracted or even harshly treated for just having the idea or notion that it's possible the bee could take care of itself and its genetics. We want to be able to give people that place and venue to learn from each other on a consistent basis. We don't have to just wait for conferences and meetings to get that information. You can go right online, go into that forum and share that info with each other and have access to each other. With that, I thank you all so much for those who have stopped by. I thank you all so much for hanging in there with me, and to the last 20 or so participants that are just there by a thread. Have a good night. Enjoy your spring, and we'll be talking to you soon. Good night.